Imagine waking up one morning and looking in the mirror, only to realize the person staring back at you is a stranger. Not in the way that sleep-deprived mornings sometimes make us feel disconnected, but in a way that cuts deeper, a way that makes you wonder when, exactly, you stopped being you. The eyes are yours, the face is yours, but something fundamental has shifted. You reach for your coffee, your phone, your cigarette, your drink, your scroll through social media, and in that automatic gesture you feel it. A compulsion so familiar it's become invisible. You tell yourself it's a choice, that you're in control, that this is just who you are now. But somewhere beneath the surface, a question whispers with increasing urgency. Am I choosing this, or is this choosing me? Here's the paradox that haunts every human being who's ever felt the pull of compulsion. We believe we are the authors of our own lives, the captains of our souls, the sovereign rulers of our choices. We construct elaborate narratives about our freedom, our authenticity, our true selves. Yet simultaneously, we find ourselves doing things we don't want to do, becoming people we swore we'd never become, trapped in patterns we can't explain. We say, I am a smoker, or I am an alcoholic, or I am addicted to work, or I need my phone. As if these behaviors are intrinsic to our identity, as permanent as our eye color or blood type. But what if the very moment you started saying, I am, about your addiction was the moment you stopped being you? Consider this. Every addiction, every compulsion, every habit that owns you rather than the reverse, begins with a simple substitution. You replace one thing for another. You exchange a moment of genuine feeling for a moment of numbness. You trade authentic connection for artificial stimulation. You swap presence for escape. And in that exchange, something more sinister occurs. You begin to replace your actual identity with a borrowed one, a false self constructed around the object of your compulsion. The addict doesn't just consume the substance consumes the addict's sense of self. What makes this truly terrifying is how gradual and invisible the process becomes. You don't wake up one day and suddenly find yourself possessed by something external. Instead, it happens through 1,000 tiny surrenders, a million microscopic moments where you chose immediate relief over long-term authenticity. Each time you reach for the fix, whatever form it takes, you're not just satisfying a craving. You're reinforcing a neural pathway that whispers, this is who you are. This is what you need. This is your identity. But here's the question that should shake you to your core. If addiction can hijack your identity so completely that you can't tell where you end and the compulsion begins, then who were you before? And more importantly, who could you be if you broke free? What if the person you think you are, the one defined by your habits, your cravings, your compulsions, is nothing more than an elaborate imposter? What if your true identity has been sitting in a locked room inside you this entire time, waiting for you to remember it exists? The rabbit hole goes deeper than you think. And once you start descending, you'll never see yourself or your choices the same way again. The mechanism by which addiction hijacks identity isn't mystical or supernatural. It's devastatingly logical, rooted in the very architecture of how human beings construct their sense of self. To understand this, we need to journey into the shadowy territories explored by Carl Jung, who understood that the psyche is not a unified fortress, but a fractured landscape of competing forces. Jung spoke of the shadow, those parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, the disowned aspects of our being that we bury in the unconscious. But what happens when addiction becomes the vehicle through which the shadow expresses itself? What happens when the part of you that you're running from becomes the very thing you run toward? Here's the hidden truth. Addiction doesn't begin with the substance, the behavior, or the compulsion. It begins with a void. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us that when we stare into the abyss stares back into us. But what he didn't fully articulate is that most people never consciously choose to stare into that abyss. They stumble into it, unprepared and terrified, when life strips away their defenses. It might be trauma, loss, disappointment, or simply the crushing weight of existential meaninglessness that Jean-Paul Sartre described as the fundamental condition of human existence. We are, in Sartre's words, condemned to be free, burdened with the terrible responsibility of creating meaning in a universe that offers none. This is where addiction offers its seductive bargain, promises to fill the void, to silence the existential terror, to give you an identity when you feel like you're dissolving into nothingness. Arthur Schopenhauer understood that human beings are driven by an insatiable will, a blind, unconscious force that propels us forward in an endless cycle of desire and suffering. We want, we acquire, we briefly feel satisfied, and then the wanting begins again. Addiction supercharges this cycle, offering a shortcut to satisfaction while simultaneously ensuring that satisfaction remains forever out of reach. The craving becomes the identity, the pursuit becomes the purpose. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered something profound about human nature. We can endure almost any suffering if we have a why, a reason, a meaning, a purpose that transcends the pain. But addiction inverts this principle. It gives you a why that is entirely hollow, a purpose that exists only to perpetuate itself. You wake up thinking about the fix. You organize your day around obtaining it. You measure your worth by your ability to maintain or hide the habit. Slowly, imperceptibly, the addiction becomes your organizing principle, the sun around which your entire psychological solar system orbits. The neurological reality mirrors this philosophical trap. Your brain, that magnificent 3-pound universe, operates on a system of rewards and reinforcements. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation and desire, doesn't actually generate pleasure. It generates wanting. When you engage in addictive behavior, you flood your brain with dopamine, which your neural circuitry interprets as, "This is important. This is survival. This is who we are." Over time, your brain literally rewires itself, strengthening the neural pathways associated with the addiction while weakening pathways connected to other sources of meaning and identity. But here's where it becomes truly insidious. Your conscious mind, desperate to maintain the illusion of coherence and control, begins to construct a narrative that justifies this neural hijacking. You don't just develop a habit, you develop a story about who you are because of that habit. I'm the creative type who needs alcohol to unlock inspiration. I'm the high achiever who thrives on work addiction. I'm the anxious person who needs medication. Scrolling, shopping to function. These aren't just excuses, they're identity formations. They're the ego's attempt to make sense of behavior it can't fully control by pretending the behavior defines the self. Aldous Huxley, in his exploration of consciousness and transcendence, noted that human beings have an innate desire to escape the confines of ordinary awareness. We seek, he argued, to transcend the self, and when healthy paths to transcendence are blocked, we'll take whatever shortcuts are available. Addiction is a counterfeit transcendence, a false escape that doesn't liberate you from the prison of self but rather shrinks that prison until it becomes a cage you carry everywhere. The hidden problem, then, is this: you didn't just become addicted to a substance or behavior. You became addicted to a version of yourself. A false identity that feels more manageable, more coherent, more explicable than the vast, terrifying mystery of who you actually are. The addiction gave you boundaries when you felt boundless, gave you definition when you felt dissolving, gave you a script when you felt lost in improvisation. And now, breaking free doesn't just mean giving up a habit. It means demolishing the false self you've spent years constructing and facing the ultimate question. Without this defining compulsion, who am I? The real tragedy of addiction's identity hijacking isn't what you can see. The damaged relationships, the health consequences, the financial wreckage. Those are merely symptoms. The unseen consequence, the one that operates in the shadows of your consciousness, is how addiction systematically dismantles your capacity to know yourself. Every time you surrender to the compulsion, You're not just choosing the substance or behavior over something else. You're choosing not to be present for the person you're becoming. You're trading authentic self-knowledge for a prepackaged identity that requires no exploration, no growth, no uncomfortable self-confrontation. Consider the cognitive bias known as choice supportive bias, the tendency to retroactively ascribe positive attributes to an option we've chosen, even when that choice harms us. Your brain, in its desperate attempt to maintain psychological coherence, will literally rewrite your memories and perceptions to justify the addictive behavior. You'll remember the relief more vividly than the shame. You'll recall the temporary euphoria more clearly than the prolonged emptiness that followed. Your mind becomes an unreliable narrator of your own life story, editing and revising in real time to protect the false identity that addiction has constructed. This creates a devastating feedback loop. The more you engage in the addictive behavior, the more your brain reinforces the neural pathways associated with it, the more your identity crystallizes around it, and the more threatening any alternative identity becomes. Who would you be without your coping mechanism? Without your defining struggle? Without the narrative you've built around your compulsion? These questions become existentially terrifying because you've outsourced your sense of self to something external. You've made an object, a substance, a behavior, a pattern, responsible for answering the question, who am I? The neurological reality is even more sobering. Research into addiction and brain plasticity reveals that chronic engagement with addictive substances or behaviors actually shrinks the prefrontal cortex, the region of your brain responsible for executive function, impulse control, and self-reflection. In other words, the very part of your brain that would normally help you step back, observe your patterns, and make conscious choices about who you want to be is being systematically weakened. You're not just developing a habit, you're neurologically sabotaging your capacity for self-authorship. But perhaps the most insidious unseen consequence is what psychologists call ego depletion, combined with identity foreclosure. Every human being has a finite amount of willpower and decision-making capacity each day. When addiction occupies the center of your mental life, when you're constantly negotiating with yourself about whether to indulge, constantly managing the shame and hiding the behavior, constantly planning your next fix or promising yourself it's the last one, you drain this finite resource. You use up all your psychological energy maintaining the addiction and managing the false identity it's created. Nothing remains for the harder, more important work of discovering who you authentically are. Identity foreclosure, a term from developmental psychology, describes what happens when someone commits to an identity without adequately exploring alternatives. Healthy identity formation requires experimentation, failure, reflection, and revision. But addiction short-circuits this process. It offers you a ready-made identity. Addict, user, workaholic, compulsive whatever. And because this identity comes with a built-in narrative, a community, even if it's a community of fellow sufferers, and a sense of purpose, obtaining and using, it feels safer than the terrifying openness of genuine self-discovery. Here's where the cultural dimension amplifies everything. We live in a society that is itself addicted to productivity, to distraction, to consumption, to image management, to the constant stimulation of our dopamine systems through social media, news cycles, and manufactured urgency. The culture doesn't just enable your personal addiction, it normalizes the very mechanism of addiction as a way of life. When everyone around you is also outsourcing their identity to external objects and behaviors, when the entire social fabric is woven from compulsions and cravings, your personal addiction becomes almost invisible. You can hide in plain sight, telling yourself that everyone is struggling with something, that this is just how modern life works. But beneath this normalized chaos, something profound is dying. Your capacity for what the philosopher Martin Buber called I-thou relationships, genuine, present, authentic encounters with others and with yourself, atrophies. Addiction converts everything into I-it relationships, where people, experiences, and even your own consciousness become mere instruments for obtaining the fix. You stop meeting reality and start using it. You stop encountering your own depths and start managing your surfaces. The ultimate unseen consequence is this. You become a ghost haunting your own life. You go through the motions. You perform the role. You maintain the appearance. But the authentic you, the one with unique gifts, unexplored potentials, genuine desires that can't be satisfied by any substance or compulsion, is locked away, starving in darkness, forgotten. And the most heartbreaking part? You've forgotten there's anyone locked away at all. The false identity has become so complete, so convincing, so comfortable in its misery, that you've stopped searching for the real you. You've stopped believing there's anyone else to find. The pathway to freedom begins not with willpower, not with promises, not with New Year's resolutions or desperate bargaining with yourself. It begins with a single, radical act of intellectual honesty, acknowledging that the person you've become is not the person you are. This distinction between the constructed self and the authentic self is where liberation takes root. But here's the paradox that will either save you or break you. You cannot find your true identity by searching for it. You can only find it by dismantling everything that isn't it. Think of the sculptor Michelangelo, who claimed he didn't create his masterpieces but rather revealed them by removing everything that wasn't the statue. Your authentic identity works the same way. It's already there, beneath the accumulated layers of compulsion, shame, false narratives, and borrowed identities. The rebellion isn't about becoming someone new. It's about the courageous work of subtraction, of chiseling away everything that addiction has added until what remains is irreducible, essential, you. But this process requires something our culture rarely teaches: the capacity to sit with unbearable emptiness. When you first stop feeding the addiction, you don't immediately discover who you are. Instead, you discover a terrifying void, the very void you've been running from all along. This is the moment where most people relapse, not because the craving is too strong, but because the emptiness feels like annihilation. You must understand, this emptiness is not a problem to be solved. It's a doorway to be walked through. The existentialists understood this profoundly. Soren Kierkegaard wrote about the leap of faith, that moment when rational understanding ends and you must jump into uncertainty without guarantees. Breaking free from addiction requires a similar leap, but instead of faith in God, it requires faith in the possibility of an authentic self that exists independent of your compulsions. You must believe in someone you've never met, the person you could become if you stopped being the person addiction has made you. Here's a radical reframe that changes everything. Stop thinking of recovery as giving up something and start thinking of it as refusing to be lied to anymore. Every time you reach for the fix, your addiction is telling you a lie. This is what you need. This is who you are. This is the only way to feel okay. The rebellion is simply saying, I don't believe you anymore. Not with aggression, not with self-hatred, but with the calm certainty of someone who's finally seen through a con artist's scheme. Viktor Frankl, in the concentration camps, discovered that the prisoners who survived weren't necessarily the strongest or healthiest, but those who maintained what he called tragic optimism. The ability to find meaning even in suffering, to choose one's attitude even when everything else has been stripped away. You must cultivate this same capacity. Your addiction has stripped away everything except one freedom. The freedom to choose who you will be in this moment, right now, regardless of what you've been before. Practically, this means creating what psychologists call identity-based habits rather than outcome-based goals. Don't say, I want to quit drinking. Say, I am becoming someone who doesn't need alcohol to be present. Don't say, I'm trying to stop scrolling my phone compulsively. Say, I am becoming someone who chooses depth over distraction. This linguistic shift is not mere semantics. It's a fundamental reorientation of your relationship to change. You're not battling against something. You're evolving towards someone. But you cannot do this alone, and here's why. The false identity that addiction created was built in isolation, in hiding, in the secret spaces where shame breeds. The authentic identity can only emerge in connection, in vulnerability, in the courageous act of letting others see you without the mask. This doesn't necessarily mean traditional support groups, though they can help. It means finding even one person, a friend, a therapist, a mentor, who can hold space for the messy, uncertain process of your becoming. Someone who can remind you that you're not your addiction when the addiction tries to convince you otherwise. There's a Zen Buddhist concept called beginner's mind, approaching everything with openness and lack of preconceptions, even things you think you know. You must bring this mindset to your own identity. Every morning, wake up and ask, who am I today? Not who was I yesterday? Not who does my history say I must be? But who am I choosing to be in this moment? This daily practice of conscious self-authorship gradually builds a new neural architecture, one where you, not your compulsion, occupy the throne of your consciousness. The rebellion also requires what Nietzsche called the revaluation of all values, questioning every assumption about what makes life worth living. Your addiction promised meaning through escape, through numbness, through the endless pursuit of a satisfaction that never quite arrives. True freedom demands that you discover alternative sources of meaning. Creation instead of consumption, connection instead of isolation, presence instead of escape, growth instead of stasis. You must become, in Nietzsche's famous phrase, a creator of your own values. Someone who decides what matters rather than letting addiction decide for you. Finally, understand this. Breaking free is not a destination but a practice, not an achievement but a daily choice. Some days you will choose your authentic self. Some days you will slip back into the false one. The difference between freedom and captivity is not perfection but direction. Are you moving toward the person you want to become or away from them? Are you listening to the voice of your authentic self or the voice of the addiction? The rebellion is simply the commitment to keep asking these questions, keep choosing consciousness over automaticity, keep remembering that you are not what you consume, you are not your worst moments, you are not your compulsions. You are the one who chooses. And that choosing, repeated across thousands of moments, is how you reclaim your identity from the hijacker. Here is the truth that will either liberate you or haunt you for the rest of your life. Your addiction was never actually about the substance, the behavior, or the compulsion. It was always about your relationship to yourself. Every time you reached for the fix, you were reaching away from something, not toward something. You were running from the most terrifying and most sacred encounter a human being can have, the unmediated experience of being alive, conscious, and responsible for creating meaning in a universe that offers no instruction manual. The deepest revelation is this: the version of you that became addicted, that constructed an entire false identity around a compulsion, was doing something profoundly human and even, in a twisted way, creative. You were solving a problem. You were managing unbearable feelings. You were creating coherence out of chaos. The addiction was never a sign of weakness. It was a sign of your psyche's desperate ingenuity in the face of suffering it didn't know how to process. Your false identity wasn't a failure. It was a survival mechanism. And now, having survived, you get to evolve beyond mere survival into something that looks like actual living. But here's where everything crystallizes into a single, irreducible insight. You have never actually lost your authentic identity. It's not something that was destroyed by addiction, stolen from you, or buried so deep it's irretrievable. Your true self has been there the entire time, waiting beneath the false identity like a patient friend in a quiet room, watching all your struggles with compassion, never judging, never leaving, simply existing. The person you're searching for isn't someone you need to become. It's someone you need to remember. Think about this carefully. There have been moments, perhaps fleeting, perhaps years ago, when you felt utterly yourself. Maybe it was creating something or helping someone, or experiencing a moment of natural beauty, or being in conversation so authentic that time disappeared. In those moments, the addiction wasn't in control. The false identity had temporarily dropped away, and what you felt in those spaces wasn't foreign or new. It felt like coming home, like finally being who you always were beneath everything else. This is the paradigm shift that changes everything. Recovery isn't about building a new identity from scratch. It's about archaeology. It's about excavation. It's about removing the accumulated debris of trauma, shame, fear, and compulsion until you rediscover the bedrock of who you've always been. The you that existed before you learned to doubt yourself, before you started outsourcing your sense of worth to external validation, before you needed anything outside yourself to feel complete. And here's the most powerful paradox of all. The moment you fully accept that you are not your addiction is the same moment you can have compassion for the part of you that became addicted. You don't have to hate the false identity to transcend it. You don't have to wage war against yourself to find peace. You can simply see the addiction for what it was, a chapter in your story, not the story itself. A strategy that once served a purpose and has now outlived its usefulness. A version of you that emerged in response to pain and can now be released with gratitude for having kept you alive long enough to discover something better. The ultimate truth is that identity itself is fluid, not fixed. You are not a static thing to be discovered once and forever. You are a process, a becoming, a constant unfolding. Every moment offers you the opportunity to author yourself anew. The addiction hijacked this creative process by convincing you that you were a finished story, a defined character, a fixed type. But you're not a noun, you're a verb. You're not a thing that is, you're a being that becomes. This is why freedom feels so terrifying. It means accepting that you are responsible for creating yourself in every moment, that there is no solid ground beneath you, no permanent identity to cling to, no final answer to the question, who am I? The existential vertigo this produces is immense, but it's also the source of your power. If you are not fixed, you cannot be broken. If you are constantly becoming, every moment is an opportunity for transformation. The you of yesterday does not determine the you of tomorrow unless you allow it to. Consider how this reframes everything. Every person who has ever broken free from addiction has had to confront the same terrifying revelation. They had to realize that they are fundamentally free to choose, free to change, free to become someone entirely different from who they've been. And that freedom is so absolute, so complete, so total that it becomes a responsibility they can never escape. You are free. You have always been free. Even when addiction felt like a prison, you were the one choosing moment by moment to remain in that prison. And you are also the one who can choose moment by moment to walk out. The final, most powerful realization is simply this: you are not who you think you are. Not the addict. Not the recovered addict. Not the person defined by struggles or triumphs. You are the awareness that witnesses all of this. You are the consciousness that observes your thoughts, your cravings, your choices, your identities as they arise and pass away. You are the space in which all experience occurs. And that space, that pure awareness, can never be addicted to anything because it is not a thing at all. It is the fundamental mystery of being alive. When you touch this truth, even for a moment, everything changes. The addiction loses its power because you've seen through the illusion that you needed it to be complete. The false identity dissolves because you've recognized it as just another thought arising in consciousness. And what remains is simply this: the quiet presence of being alive, awake, and free to choose who you will become in the next breath, and the next, and the next. Your identity was never hijacked. You simply forgot that you were the one holding the keys the entire time. And now, finally, you can remember. You can unlock the door. You can step into the vast, terrifying, beautiful openness of being fully, authentically, impossibly yourself. This is not the end of your story. This is where your real story begins.